Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, I am AK Rex. I am here with my now moderator and assistant and a friend, John Michalski. Hello, John.
Hello.
So we're finally here to bring you the episode 3 of this, and this is gonna be a juicy episode. I think we have both been looking forward to this one for a while, haven't we, John? Even though it took us forever to finally get to it.
Yeah, this is you know, considering that I'm someone that lives in Utah right now and who lives really close to Dinosaur National Monument himself, this episode hits different for me, and I'm really looking forward to talking more about it.
Well, I suppose without further ado, let's get started. So in this episode, we get taken to, and we are going to open up that setting where we are supposedly at, and we are looking at Morrison formation. So everybody knows, most people who are watching this right now probably know about what Morrison formation is. It's a place where a lot of really cool looking dinosaurs come from, and very famous ones too, located in the United States of America. So, do you want to? Well, obviously, first of all, I wanted to say that the show tells us that the events take place in 150 million years ago. So we have to bear that in mind because it might play to some of the few bits and pieces that I have on my list of notes to bring up later. But for now, would you like to take us through the slide and explain what you put together here, please?
Sure. So, in making this, the first shot of the segment begins in Salt Lake City, where at the foot of the Wasatch Range, where back 150 million years ago, the Wasatch Range wasn't really a thing. The episode describes the formation as being at one time a vast savanna that stretched from Idaho south, or no, from Canada south to New Mexico, and from Idaho east to Nebraska. Which, as far as I can tell, that is still accurate. The Morrison Formation is enormous. It's in scale. Like it covers so many states. And now most of the dinosaurs that we find there are usually within Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming, and then bits and bobs in like Montana or Oklahoma or New Mexico. But it's still it still holds up. When John Goodman describes the geographic layout of the Morrison Formation, it is huge. Now, technically, the region that I focused on for the middle slide there with the big golden star is Dinosaur National Monument. And that's because at some point the documentary um, has has a scene where James Kirkland talks about Dinosaur National Monument and what was the possibility for why so many dinosaurs died there. And we'll get into that later on, but that's sort of where I predict the episode is taking place at. It is around where the big quarry wall near Jensen, Utah is at. So that's why I put the big golden star there. Um, as for the interpretation of the habitat as being a bit of a seasonal savanna with very hard dry seasons and very wet seasons. As far as I can tell, the Morrison Formation spans a pretty extensive period of time. So obviously, I don't think this would have been the only habitat that would have existed over the course of those several millions of years. But this seems to be the one that is very often cited in towards the end of the by like the end of the Camarasaurian and the beginning and the end of the Tithonian stages of the Jurassic. That the Morrison Formation was this essentially a savanna, but without grass. But instead of grass, it was mostly ferns and fern prairies and riparian forests, gallery forests. Um, Generally, it wasn't like a super humid, very thick jungle-like habitat or lively forest necessarily, although forests existed. It was, again, I use the word savanna because I think it's probably one of the best descriptors for the kind of habitat it supported back then. So I think in general, I think the setting is still very solid. And like I said before, the fact that I'm living in Utah and I live super close to the monument itself makes this it's really cool to see like how much this holds up since I was a kid, and to see like, my own home state and home region being represented in this documentary. So, but yeah, I think overall the setting gets 2 thumbs up from me.
I wanted to question this choice of depiction, though, for one reason is that obviously maybe it might have to do with a specific location. Perhaps that might have been a thing, because we do frequently bring up the topic of how the niche partitioning works in Morrison formation of variety of different predatory dinosaurs, especially when we look at them, and how do they fit in all this system, and how does this system manage to support these type of animals coexisting in it. And it's frequently brought to attention, at least to my attention, that some animals were more frequently found in places that were more associated with denser foliage, while the others were more associated with more open sort of spaces, and occasionally they would cross over from time to time, but mostly they would be very much on a different sort of field, if you will. And
Right.
Allosaurus in particular, which we will get to in this segment later on, does come up as an animal that was predominantly associated with a more open field type of animal, whereas the Torvosaurus, which does not make appearance in this episode, and Ceratosaurus, which does make an appearance in this episode, both actually preferred, or at least the evidence shows they were more favoring the more denser foliage type of environment for some reason. So that kind of makes it somewhat interesting. And the reason I say that is that I think that a lot of the differences between the environments there have to do with what you have pointed out earlier on. It has to do a lot with because of how big the information is, and it spans big areas, which is not surprising that you would find different kinds of environments, being there basically. And thus in different environments you would find different animals. I guess that would make sense. But in this case, we're looking at specific place in Utah, which, if I'm correct, you mentioned that it corresponds quite well to what was depicted in the show.
Yes, I do. First of all, I do agree with you on the niche partitioning going on between predators and also herbivores too, where like I've heard that diplodocids tend to go into more open lacustrine areas, whereas macronarians like Brachiosaurus and Camarasaurus may have preferred riparian forests and areas where there was more rivers than lakes. I think if there's one thing I would have changed about the setting in this segment here, and hopefully I would have been going to give it a lot more time instead of just a 20-minute block within a 90-minute program, that is When Dinosaurs Roamed America, I would have probably made the niche partitioning a little bit more, maybe make it a bit more of a point, and maybe show off those two different habitats. Even though they were relatively close together and there could have been overlap, I think that would have been really neat to see in a documentary where you have these different dinosaur communities in two neighboring environments. I think I would have just, but also that would have also maybe required a bit more time instead of what we got in the segment. So, but yes, I think I still hold to the opinion that this segment holds up pretty well in terms of habitat interpretation and general setting interpretation.
I would have loved to see something like that as well, because Morrison is actually one of those examples that is not very common, where several different niches like that can coexist. To compare it to something else like Dinosaur Park Formation, which, as we know, is extremely rich with dinosaur fossils of different kinds and with a variety of species, etc. The one thing that we notice that a lot of the taxa in there is actually related via anagenesis, meaning that they don't tend to, most of them are not contemporary, many of them just consecutively basically appear and disappear following each other up in whatever order. While in this case we have a lot of animals that coexist in parallel with one another as contemporaries, and they do end up fulfilling completely different niches and occasionally overlapping, which I think was a bit of a missed opportunity for this specific program. My personal view, of course, but I think they could have given this a bit more value if they were to exploit that particular aspect and at least have unfolded it a little bit more.
Yeah, I can respect that.
Now, um, shall we jump into dinosaurs themselves, or do you want to add something else to the setting?
I think, yeah, we can jump into dinosaurs. I think anything that we need to refer back to the slide, we will with each individual species. So,
Yes, and of course we have to always remember that because there are some points that I brought up, and I will make it clear why. I want the viewers to pay specific attention that the show tells us that this is happening 150 million years ago. And we have to bear in mind that if they, when somebody says, oh, but 151 or 152, it's only 2 or 1 million years apart, it's not big, right? Not big difference, right? Like, who knows, just 1 million years apart, mistake. No, you have to be precise. I'm sorry if it's gonna maybe annoy some people. It's annoying me too in some cases when I'm trying to hunt for certain kinds of information and understand certain things and aspects of these ecosystems and how they would be put together, and you find these kind of weird disparities. And sometimes, of course, the wiki articles don't give you good information either, because we know that they are very flawed in many cases. You have to check the sources all the time, but it's just how it is. You have to be precise. I mean, otherwise, what's the point? But let's get into dinosaurs. I'm going to bring up. Let's see, which one shall we go for? Well, let's go. Let's start off with the Dryosaurus. I mean, why not, right?
sure.
So, I've got this slide that you have put together of the Dryosaurus, and would you like to explain what you have done here and why have you specifically chosen these particular shots?
Sure. So, on the left are two shots from the documentary. On top is one that I've screenshotted, while on the copy from YouTube, it's a little bit blurry, but it was the only one that really gives a proper look at Dryosaurus in full body and like at a horizontal angle. It's not like on top or whatever. And then on the bottom is the three Dryosaurus that appear in the episode, the mother and her two offspring. One of the things that I kind of like about this, it's not super noticeable, but the mother is on the left in that bottom left photo, or yeah, photo, and her face is a little bit darker than that of the offspring. Now, the offspring appear to be like they're coming close to adulthood, so I can understand why they're a little bit different, but I do appreciate that the offspring themselves are a little bit lighter in color, and there's some degree of ontogenic differences between both between the individuals, which I find pretty neat. Now, I also chose a picture that was put in the Discord server by our good friend Jeffrey Bond from the George Eccles Dinosaur Park in Ogden, Utah, of Dryosaurus. And I think, comparing the skeleton to the actual thing, it seems to hold up pretty well. Um, I do want to point out that I labeled Dryosaurus in this slide as Dryosaurus elderae. And the reason I say that is because Dryosaurus elderae is currently, last I checked, it's the species of Dryosaurus that is found in Dinosaur National Monument. Dryosaurus altus is known from Utah, to the best of my knowledge, but specifically elderae is known from Dinosaur National Monument. Now, I have looked into what differentiates both species, and as far as I can tell, they are not. It's not like there's any crazy differences that are like super noticeable, like what you see with, for example, Triceratops, where Triceratops prorsus has a much more noticeably longer nose horn, whereas Triceratops horridus has a slightly longer snout and shallower snout, and has a smaller nasal horn. Individual variation notwithstanding. And in this case, as far as I can tell, elderae and altus are have they generally are very, very similar in appearance, but there are like important differences. But I don't think that would be enough to like for me to heavily like say that this model is bad. I think it still holds up really well, even for an elderae, and at the same time, I think the skeleton here might be of altus. But Jeffrey, if you're watching this, feel free to correct me on that. But overall, I think it still holds up pretty well, like comparing the both of them. I really like it as a model. It doesn't have like any trendy like feathers or filaments or whatever. And I think I don't know, I really like it. Definitely, I think has a lot of features that make it diagnostic of Dryosaurus that still hold up pretty well. And then the bottom right photo is a drawing by Raul Ramos, I believe, who just drew a Dryosaurus. I think the color scheme is based off the Isle, but I'm not. Don't quote me on that. With some eggs. Now, Dryosaurus. Finding like really good Dryosaurus reconstructions that I can compare with the one from the documentary is actually harder than it would sound. Because the most common one that comes up is like the Dryosaurus from Jurassic World Evolution. And while I don't dislike that model, I don't trust it enough for me to be like, yeah, this is a reasonable looking Dryosaurus. And a lot of other ones are like, even if the body and proportions and the structure itself is okay, it's like it's sometimes they'll have like feathers or filaments and stuff like that. And just so we're clear, there is no evidence that Dryosaurus had any of that. So if we find a Dryosaurus with it, I will retract this statement. But until now, we have no evidence for it. So finding a really good quality scaly Dryosaurus has been really difficult. So, but this is one I really like. It's a nice behavior of just seeing a Dryosaurus just with its offspring. And I think, I don't know, I really like it, so I put it in here. And I think overall I'm pretty satisfied with Dryosaurus in this episode. It's nice to see some attention brought to the smaller dinosaurs of the Morrison, since a lot of programs tend to focus on the really big stuff, the big sauropods and theropods and stegosaurs and all that. But I'm really glad that at least for like the first half of the segment that Dryosaurus has given some attention to it. So overall, I'm pretty positive. If you've got any thoughts, feel free to share now.
I generally am very positive towards Dryosaurus as well. There is one thing I wanted to cite here that is very important, that to my knowledge at least, as of the moment of recording this video, I have not come across any mention or any evidence whether or not we have found any mature animal. So one thing to note is that a lot of the Dryosaurus that were found are actually not mature animals.
That's true.
And that's what makes it interesting. What are we going to be looking at if we look at a mature animal, and how much different would it be from their younger counterparts, and how to predict which way it's going to go. And how much bigger could they grow it as well, because they could have been as big as Camarasaurus, but maybe faster and leaner builds, so maybe faster runners perhaps. Maybe there's another side to them that distinguishes them from each other in terms of how they feed in their niches, maybe preferred habitats, which would be interesting, because we also do not have Camarasaurus featured in this program, by the way, as well. So it's another point to make. And I have one thing I wanted to mention though about Dryosaurus, and it's the program, how it depicts some aspect of a behavior, which I'm curious whether or not this would actually be plausible, although I think it is plausible, and I will explain why in a moment. It's how it's trailing the Camarasaurus herd and basically picking up the waste food that the bigger animals leave behind, which they cannot eat basically, with them finishing it off. Pretty much, you would say that's what they're doing. They're picking up the leftovers, which, let's just say, one dinosaur's trash becomes another dinosaur's treasure. And,
Exactly.
I found this to be a very neat move on behalf of the program. I thought that was a very neat move, because this is part of their perhaps redeeming part. This is a redeeming part of their program in terms of where they have not been able to capitalize on showing some parts of niche partitioning that we were mentioned earlier on. They have managed to show this part of niche partitioning, where they see that certain animals that eat a certain way do not pick things off from the ground, like Camarasaurus, for example. They just pick things off the trees, mostly, or tall bushes, depending on how convenient it is for them to reach it. But when it comes to Dryosaurus, it's very happy to basically go around and pick up all the leftovers, and would probably be pretty content with it. So I found that to be a very good positive point to documentary makers choosing to represent this kind of behavior.
Right, right. Something that just came up to my head regarding Dryosaurus that I do think might, and I know, like, for all this positivity, this might be one of my first negative about it. So the documentary compares Dryosaurus and sauropods in that Dryosaurus chews its food compared to sauropods. Now, as far as I can tell, I don't know exactly if there's evidence for Dryosaurus having cheeks. It wouldn't surprise me if there was. And if someone in the comment sections wants to tell me that, let me know. But I have actually asked a few people about chewing in ornithopods prior to the evolution of like iguanodonts and Cretaceous ornithopods. And as far as I can tell, Dryosaurus wasn't specifically chewing its food either. It was still very much like plucking stuff and stripping it, more so in a way that would have been more that it wasn't necessarily chewing its food per se. It's a minor thing. It's just a line in the show, but just something to point out that even at the very late Jurassic, ornithopods like Dryosaurus, as far as I can tell, were still not full-on chewers in the same sense that a iguanodon was just yet. So I think that might be my only major complaint about, and by major I mean super minor complaint about how Dryosaurus is depicted.
I agree. That's actually a very good point that I have missed myself. That they do indeed refer to it that way, which actually is not very accurate and slightly misleading. But otherwise, it's very interesting that I actually find Dryosaurus to probably be my favorite animal in terms of how it's depicted in this episode, which is really interesting. So, because I have the least amount of, I would say, complaints both about the model that they've chosen for it and how they depicted the behavior.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think this is one of the best dinosaurs in the program so far, so.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely on point with that one. Dryosaurus all the way. I always liked this animal anyway, even though it's
Yeah.
very interesting because it's a very simple looking ornithopod. There's really nothing much to it. I mean, it is an ornithopod as far as I'm aware of. It's not a neornithischian, right? So neornithicians come a bit later, I believe, if I'm correct. Or if they do already show up at this time period, I don't think Dryosaurus was one of them, right? It was an ornithopod. So correct me in the comments if you know for certain, because for some reason it escapes me right now. But yeah, very big fan of this critter. Would have loved to have met one IRL, but oh well. So
Fair enough.
it's like one of those things that, it frequently gets chosen as the so-called cute option, whenever games try to include something. When it's dinosaurs, they're like trying to balance the quote-unquote scary and mean or like badass looking things with more cute things, and Dryosaurus frequently gets picked to represent the cute ones. So I suppose that's where it fits. Now,
For sure.
Whether it was actually cute or not, let's just remember that even as something as small as a freaking farm goose can absolutely kick your ass, this thing was potentially growing above 6 meters or so long, just so you know. So
Right.
there's a very big debate to be had whether or not it would have been very cute if you encountered one in the IRL. So anyway, are you happy with this dinosaur so far?
I'm happy
Or
with
shall
it.
we move on, or are you...
I think we can move on to the next one.
Okay, yeah, let's go next then. And the next one we are going to go to... Okay, let's go to our sauropods, actually. So, first one, I am going to open up Camarasaurus, and we have picked lentus to be the species because, well, there is a variety of reasons, I think, why lentus, since the show doesn't specifically tell us as far as I know. But that's one other thing I noticed, that many of the documentary programs, they almost never tell you the species names, aside from Tyrannosaurus rex.
But that doesn't count because I mean, it sort of counts, but it also doesn't, because it's more like a force of habit that we call it Tyrannosaurus rex instead of saying Camarasaurus lentus. So
yeah.
But I chose Camarasaurus lentus because it is, as far as I can tell, the main Camarasaurus species found at Dinosaur National Monument. And I also believe it lines up pretty well with the timing of this episode. So Camarasaurus lentus is the middle child of Camarasaurus species. It is also the second biggest, I believe.
No.
So we have
no.
Camarasaurus grandis.
Sorry.
Wait, what?
Sorry. Incorrect. I have to correct you there.
Oh, I'm being called out.
Yep, you're being called out, Johnny boy. So it's actually the smallest species of the three. You were correct about the part that it's the middle in terms of the way it's positioned in the time period. So what happened was that Camarasaurus grandis was the oldest species. It's the second largest species. So then Camarasaurus lentus shows up. They exist as contemporaries for a while. Grandis goes extinct. Lentus keeps going forever until later, I think lentus also declines and disappears, and then the last one, which is the biggest and the type species, Supremus, appears and replaces it completely.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense then. So
lentus, however, you were correct as well, that it's the most commonly known and understood species, which is quite surprised because it's not the type species, which happens quite from time to time, that type species are not actually as well known sometimes and well described as some other species that end up coming up. But lentus is the most commonly represented species, and I think it would be one of the best species to represent the genus in that sense.
Yeah. And I think in terms of depiction and general appearance, I compare it with a skeletal by Scott Hartman, and also a depiction of Camarasaurus that is from the monument itself, like the artwork that is of the dinosaurs from the monument. This is the image that you can see when you walk into the quarry hall and such of Camarasaurus in the bottom right. And I think overall, I think both are they hold the, I think Camarasaurus, animal in the show. It holds up pretty well. I did notice a shot where it has like the big toe claw that I'm sure was a thing back then, but I don't think Camarasaurus actually had that on the front on its front limbs. Um, and that actually was a bit closer to what Scott Hartman has here in the top right depiction, top right skeletal. But again, I don't have too many complaints about the appearance of Camarasaurus. I think there's nothing super about the information being told about it that like, ooh, that didn't age well or whatever. I think the only one I can think of is the bit about gastroliths, which I'm not even gonna say is necessarily wrong. It's just I know that gastroliths and sauropods are sort of, at least when I was growing up, I can't speak for what it looks like nowadays, but I always knew that was sort of made to be more universal when it was like we only saw a handful of species that you could possibly attribute like digestive gastroliths to. So it's one of those things where it's I'm kind of torn on that one, but otherwise I think overall I really like Camarasaurus in this segment. Um and it's kind of nice to see how after Walking with Dinosaurs came out that Discovery were like, okay, well, BBC already has Diplodocus and Brachiosaurus. Uh what can we use instead? And for the Macronarian side, they used Camarasaurus, which I think was it might have been their only choice, but it was an excellent choice nonetheless. So,
I agree with all accounts here, and I also think that it was a nice way for them to perhaps actually represent an animal and species that are very common overall in terms of how many of them we have found. Well, we obviously, figuratively speaking, I haven't found anything personally, but you know what I mean. But uh, yeah, it's quite surprising that the animal so commonly found in this formation actually has not been very frequently represented at all in any kind of media. To be fair,
no,
minus when it came only later, because at the time when this program was made, of course, there wasn't a lot of it being shown. Only later, games started showing us Camarasaurus, and other media perhaps there and then might have pointed something to it. Uh,
I know Jurassic Park Operation Genesis. It was Camarasaurus and Brachiosaurus.
yep, two
So,
sauropods only. Yep, that's right.
yep.
So and it was actually one of my favorite dinosaurs to breed in that game too. So I always tried to find fossils to make 100% genome for it before I started breeding one. So
Yeah.
it was a nice one to have there. But the thing I wanted to also uh, point out is very interesting how well, it's more general note to Camarasaurus itself rather than just how it was portrayed in the program specifically. It's just how cool and unique it has with this blunt sort of short snout head in comparison to many other sauropods that we know. It's just really something that I always found to be particularly attractive about this dinosaur. And I think the show did a decent enough job. I'm not saying it couldn't get better, but even for today's standards, which is how we are actually assessing this documentary, in a sense that, and to remind our audience as well, we're analyzing it based on how well it would hold up if it was made exactly as it was, but only if it was basically um, done today, right? So that's what we are looking at. And I just
Yeah.
realized that apparently my slide, for some reason, was it shrank a little bit, and I had to readjust its size. So that's fine.
Okay.
But I'm just talking about the OBS capturing the image, so it kind of sort of basically went a little bit iffy. So the audience are probably giggling while watching this, thinking, when is he gonna realize? I realized it already and corrected it. Okay, so there we go, all done. So now, are we happy with the Camarasaurus, and do we want to move on to the next dinosaur, or do you want to add something else to the Camarasaurus?
I just thought of something to add to this, and if our next dinosaur is the next sauropod in the segment, then this will tie in really well.
Yep.
So one thing that I just occurred to me, and going back to your point about niche partitioning, they don't they kind of address it, but it's more so in the segment where they show the skeleton of Camarasaurus, and it's like highlighted in blue, and they're talking about they talk about how Camarasaurus has a neck that's very vertical in nature. And that's what allows it to reach the tops of trees. Now that by itself isn't like too much, but for me anyways, it's really nice to see like some morphological evidence used to explain behavior in biology, and more specifically, like where exactly Camarasaurus was feeding most of the time. And then when you compare it to the other sauropod that we talk about, where the feeding habits are talked about in a very different way based on neck morphology and the like. Um, it's very subtle. It's not like directly telling you, yes, look, these two are very different, but it just occurred to me that there is some discussion about niche partitioning to a very wink wink nudge nudge kind of way, that I find is really fascinating. That it's another reason why I really like this segment and documentary as a whole. The little things like that. And I can explain more when we get to the next sauropod, but that was something I just remembered, and I just thought I would share that before we move on.
Yeah, I appreciate that point. That's actually the point that I haven't personally considered, which is kind of slowly going slightly against the grain of the point I made earlier on about how the program missed an opportunity to do this. But of course, my argument wasn't specifically about that. It was more to do with the preference of different environments that were actually shown that we know existed in the Morrison formation,
Yeah.
rather than the animals themselves specifically. It was more to do with more kind of bigger picture of the environments and how it affected the animals that lived in these environments and why. Basically, that was more my point, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not calling you out here. I'm just pointing out that there was just something subtle that even right now it only occurred to me just now, and I thought I would just share it because I
Hmm.
think it's quite neat that they decided to make those differences. So
I agree. I agree. It's very neat indeed. So, are we happy with
yeah,
moving to the next
yeah.
sauropod? Actually, since we did already decide that we're gonna do sauropods first. So, this just to quickly adjust the screen a bit better. This is Apatosaurus, and I am obviously I have multiple things to say about the choice of it being here, but on one hand, it's got some criticism there in terms of the choice of an animal. I will explain why shortly. On the other hand, however, if they were to simply substitute it with something else, which I will get to in a moment too, I don't think that it would have actually made any difference overall in terms of what would have been shown in the grand scheme of things here, because functionally the niche partitioning of these animals would have been pretty much the same. Now, one thing I wanted to get to is the fact that the show tells us that it takes place 150 million years ago. If I am to trust what I have dug up on Apatosaurus, and it seems that at least the information that I have dug up, which is obviously it's via Wikipedia because there's nowhere else I could specifically find the direct mention of the time period, but of course sources, always check your sources to see what is cited, to back it up, to see if there's actually a good source or if it's just somebody's blog post. Wink, wink. But I wanted to point out that Apatosaurus, both Luise and Ajax, in our case we're looking at Ajax, but let's just say either of them, they are noted as existing between 152 and 151 million years ago in both Utah and Colorado. But that means it's slightly anachronistic in the sense that it doesn't align with the time. What does align with the time, however, is Brontosaurus, which is now we also know is a valid genus, which at the time it was made was not a valid genus, I think, but we are looking at it as of now, which means that we can simply say, let's call it Brontosaurus perhaps, and that would basically fix that problem. Because nothing else would really change in this case in terms of how it would affect the way they were portrayed and what they were showing in the program. But I thought it was important to point out that time period here actually does play a big part. So for all intents and purposes, if we are looking only at Apatosaurus and that's it, we have to bear in mind that in this case Apatosaurus would have basically been extinct by now. Unless we find evidence that they existed and persisted further down, sure, why not? But to my understanding, they have already gone by then. So we would have had a Brontosaurus of some type, because there were multiple species of Brontosaurus too identified apparently. So it's like it's bad enough that apparently we realize that the genus is actually valid, but it's apparently freaking multiple species of them now. Buggers, right? So now, where does this put us here, John? What do you think?
Well, so as far as I can tell with Apatosaurus, I think when we were going through our notes and we were discussing this, I'm pretty much in agreement on the fact that if Apatosaurus wasn't exactly at 150 million years ago, then it's inaccurate. I also do believe that I think, let's just say we were people if we time travel back to when, back when they made this, and I know we're breaking a little bit of the rule here for like focusing on what we did, like focusing on if this documentary was released today, but my point here is that if we were to go back in time and tell them, actually guys, in the future Brontosaurus is going to be real, just rename it, you'll be fine, keep the model, that I still think that they would have been able to get away with naming this Brontosaurus, and they probably wouldn't have had to make enough. It's sort of like the Dryosaurus altus and elderae comparison, where even though they're both different species and they have different diagnostic characteristics that define them as species, I don't think that it would have been enough to where it would have made the model that we see in the documentary to be inaccurate at all. I think if you could have easily gotten away with the same model but calling it Brontosaurus instead of Apatosaurus. Real quick regarding the slide itself, I have in the top right corner, I have a depiction of Apatosaurus by Sergei Krasovsky, and then in the bottom right, I have a depiction of a skeletal reconstruction of Apatosaurus at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. And I decided with these two reconstructions because they both come to, I think, do a very good job of showing what Apatosaurus was like in physical appearance and also skeletal appearance. And I think with what we get in the documentary, I think they get it pretty much on the money with it. It's definitely a more robust Diplodocid than Diplodocus, or I was going to say Supersaurus, but don't quote me on that either. But I know for sure that it's much more robust than Diplodocus. And like I said in the Camarasaurus slide, the fact that Discovery went with Apatosaurus over Diplodocus is a really good move, because obviously they were going to be using something that they're going to be, going back to the same formation as Walking with Dinosaurs did. So the main idea here was to try and differentiate it enough so that they weren't like just ripping everything off of it. Because I know when Dinosaurs Roam America is sometimes cited as just a rip-off of Walking with Dinosaurs, which I strongly disagree with. And I think in this case, they made a really solid move with making Apatosaurus be the main Diplodocid sauropod compared to Diplodocus and Walking with Dinosaurs. In terms of appearance, I think the biggest thing I would probably say is like the dragon-like spines in the back. It's not very, you can't see it very easily in the slide here, but if you notice in the documentary, there's like these triangular spines that are on the back of the Apatosaurus that I question I question if that's accurate or not. But in general, I do like. Overall, I still think the model is still very good. I also appreciate, like I said in the Camarasaurus slide, how they make a point of talking about how this thing was feeding. And they make a point about saying that this thing had a more low-lying neck that was probably sweeping across lower vegetation compared to Camarasaurus. Um, and so as a result of that, there is some discussion about niche partitioning. Maybe not on the big scale that Arsene was talking about, but in a more subtle, like individual level, which I thought was really nice. Just nice to talk about biology in that sense with dinosaurs, especially the way they do it with um, they take the model, they show the skeleton, and they show features of that skeleton for everyone else to understand what they're talking about, which I really like. Um, but yeah, I think in terms of accuracy, I think that if they were to have made this into if they were to name this a Brontosaurus, I think that this would have been we would have been gold. But otherwise, I still like the model. I still like the fact they added a Apatosaurus, which is my favorite Diplodocid. And overall, I think it's as for the reason why I put it as Ajax, and Arsene can correct me on this too if I'm wrong on this as well. As far as I can tell, Apatosaurus louisei is the only known Apatosaurus species from the monument. But I also believe it comes earlier in the Jurassic. So I went with Ajax because, as far as I can tell, I think Ajax is the last or is the youngest known Apatosaurus, geologically speaking. Um, and then obviously it sounds like it ends up getting replaced by Brontosaurus right at the very end. So that's why I went with Ajax, even though Ajax, as far as I'm aware, is not specifically known from the monument. Um, and but louisei is. But I think louisei is earlier in the late Jurassic. Um, but other than that, I would probably be repeating myself by saying that I really like Apatosaurus in this. It's probably like the most inaccurate or anachronistic dinosaur so far, but it's at least in the segment. But I still really like it.
Well, I was very patient waiting for you to finish so that I could sort of slightly drop a bit of a pile of coprolites from the sky on the point you made about them not taking the same dinosaur, because there was another special program from Walking with Dinosaurs called The Ballad of Big Al. Now,
Oh,
yeah, in that one,
yeah.
actually, it's funny. They actually, I think they use both Diplodocus and Apatosaurus. I know that they definitely use Apatosaurus because that was like a new thing they introduced there for some reason. But I think they also use Diplodocus, but of course I don't want to get into these nitty-gritty bits because actually Diplodocus precedes Apatosaurus. They don't coexist. They did not coexist basically together. They were wrong time period placement basically, completely anachronistic. But that's a different rant for another time. But one thing I wanted to mention was that yes, the Walking with Dinosaurs does actually use Apatosaurus.
Yeah, well, we will get to it when in good time, but as far as
Yeah,
I can tell, I think this model does a better job of representing Apatosaurus. Because last I saw Big Al, the Apatosaurus in that looked like a bastardized Diplodocus.
pretty
At
much.
least the skull did, so
Pretty much it was, yes. It was in many ways just copy and paste and minor edit, but I don't think it truly represented and showed off, Apatosaurus for what it was, truly like a different kind of animal. Now, regarding Brontosaurus and how it fits into this picture, bear in mind there are multiple species, as I already mentioned, of Brontosaurus, and some of them were contemporary as well to Apatosaurus too, and some of them outlived it. So
yeah.
in a way, they were at one point at least contemporary to one another. Once again, this is one of those times when I would also 100% support the sentiment that you've said about going back in time and whispering to the guys, they say, hey guys, just rename it to Brontosaurus, you'll be fine. And that's it. Basically,
Yeah.
that would have 100% fixed the anachronism sort of problem. Even though, interestingly enough, of course, it's this both of these dinosaurs, they are actually not only are they Diplocidae, but they are also Apatosaurians, both Brontosaurus and, for obvious reason, Apatosaurus. They are
Yeah.
from the same. They're from the same. What's the best? What is it? Subfamily. So
Yeah, they're part of the same subfamily.
yep, and different from Diplodocus, from Diplodocinae, Diplodocinae, whatever the. Oh, holy crap! I don't know how to pronounce it properly. My tongue's breaking, but you get the point.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say that I am also in agreement with you that Apatosaurus is my favorite Diplodocid. Diplodocid. This thing is gonna freaking like torture me for the rest of this segment probably, but yeah, it's one of my favorites as well. I really like this animal for mainly because it's just it really represents, you know, this classic big sauropod type of character. Even though it was not the longest of the sauropods by far, it was also not the heaviest of the sauropods by far. But I found it to be somewhat interesting that it is one of those things that is still associated with something truly big and massive. Maybe because of the body plan and how it's generally just maybe feels like it's quite heavy even for something that is generally quite slender for the you know, because the Diplodocus were quite slender in general, but this one appears to be completely on a different level. Now the other Diplodocid that I thought would be worth mentioning, and I never actually went over it with you in the notes, but it's just a quick mention, although I think it comes a little bit later in time period, if I'm correct, which I don't know for sure if it does or not. I think it does, but there's always a way to check that. It's Barosaurus, and I believe also species called lentus.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good one too. And that one I believe has also been found at the monuments, so that would have worked really well as well.
Now the
Uh,
question I have, however, is whether or not it preceded Apatosaurus or it was contemporary to Apatosaurus. If it was a contemporary or preceded, of course, we can say that it should not have had any appearance in this program, which it did not, which was fine. But I find that the reason I mention it is because it's a very frequently underrepresented taxon for I don't know what reasons, because I think it's a pretty cool animal. I've seen its mount as well. It's pretty crazy. So,
right.
and if the suspicions turn out to be confirmed from some of their fragmentary remains, and if they associated with Barosaurus, it could have actually been freaking huge. I come to think of it,
Gotcha.
like Supersaurus maybe level huge potentially.
Okay. That's pretty big.
Yep. It might have been maybe a bit more slender in the sense that, you know, it wasn't as heavy, but it's like an oversized Diplodocus, literally, with slightly different proportions, and that's it.
Yeah.
Diplodocus had proportionally longer tail. Not Supersaurus. Barosaurus had a proportionally longer neck. That's their main minor difference, I think, in terms of the body
Okay.
sort of relationship. Anyway, are we happy with Apatosaurus?
I think so. I think so.
Do we have anything that we want to mention about how was it Apatosaurus that got ended up slipping and falling and then getting dunked on by a mob of Allosaurus, right?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I can say a couple things on that. Number one, I am it's one of my favorite scenes in the documentary, not necessarily because it's without flaws, but it's one of my favorites because um I guess for me it maybe it was parts because it was growing up and it just stuck with me the idea that this really big impressive animal is is equally as mortal as everything else in its habitat, and it falls, it breaks its leg, which personally I think it broke a lot more than its leg in that fall. I'm pretty sure it would have shattered some ribs, some vertebra. That thing is dead. Um, After a fall like that. But regardless, it has at the very least a broken leg, And now it's easy pickings for this mob of Allosaurus, which, it's just like, yeah, it's sauropods were not gods. They were not Astartes. They were not Spartans from Halo. They were animals. And the moment that you see one of these things like actually vulnerable, and it's I don't want to say it's cathartic because that sounds too weird, but to me it's like it really shows these animals as, again, they're animals, and they're easily, if something were to happen to them that makes them an easy target for any theropod, the theropods are going to take it up. Are going to take it up. And in this case, the Apatosaurus was crippled and was pretty easily dispatched by the Allosaurus, or God forbid, it was probably eaten alive for all we know, which it looked like it was during that last segment. But overall, I think it was. I don't know, I really like that segment. It's a pretty bittersweet ending to the segment overall, but I think it just reminds us that even things like this are they are not above the laws of physics and the laws of nature. And I think that's something worth keeping in mind about sauropods.
I think it's the other thing I wanted to point out about this, and the reason I brought this up as well, that notice how it was only one individual, obviously, that ended up falling into this, mistake, so to speak, when this trap, being oblivious to the landslide or whatever it was that caused it to slip that badly. And notice how it also shows how quickly the predators were there, ready to dispatch it. It's like they were waiting for the opportunity to pounce on it the moment they got there. They were just all in there right away. And that's what I found very interesting. It was both fascinating to watch, and I thought it was also, and at the same time it was obviously very cruel in a way that, yeah, it's just how it is. If an elephant were to probably end up in a similar situation, I would bet that every freaking predator nearby that could smell or sense the distress of a wounded elephant like that was unable to defend itself, and if the herd members were not able to defend it for much longer, yeah, lions and all of these hyenas, etc., jackals, anything that could have potentially, birds as well, they would have been all over that elephant. Because imagine being served a big meal like this for free, basically, just because it made its own, because of its own unfortunate circumstances, it just ended up becoming a meal for you. And that Apatosaurus would have made a very good case for that, for a similar situation here. The only thing that would have been nice, in my opinion, about the scene, if they actually included more, maybe like if they had more Ceratosaurus there, perhaps, and had them try to also sneak in to get parts of the meat away from the Allosauruses too. Because naturally, whenever something like this happens, and once you start biting, the smell of blood spreads. And predators, well, naturally, are quite good at locating where the source is. Otherwise, they would all just die very easily. So
Yeah. I think if we were to have extended this segment a bit, just in general, like make it its own episode rather than be a block within a program, I think that would have been a really nice touch to have like some Ceratosaurus come out and squabble with the Allosaurus over some scraps of meat here and there, or slabs of it. So
well, if it was its own episode, then yeah, I would have added a lot more to it than that too. To be honest, there's so much to add to this. But yeah, do you have any more things to mention for Apatosaurus?
I I don't mean to stay on this, but it just occurred to me like the tail. So they mentioned that the tail of Apatosaurus is something that they use for like defense. I don't know how accurate that is. I've heard it's very controversial. I know that the idea that Diplodocids were able to whip it like make it so that it could make a whip cracking sound. I think that's no longer considered accurate. I don't know if this is still accurate. Maybe it is. Maybe it is. But I don't know enough about it to say for sure if it is accurate, that because there's in the bottom left corner, it's the scene where the Allosaurus tries attacking the juvenile and the adult. It's right after the adult threatens it with its tail and shoos it off that way. But I don't know how accurate that is. That's all. That's my biggest and final point on Apatosaurus for this segment.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I'm not entirely certain if those tails were truly what sometimes people present them to be, in the sense of being used as weapons of self-defense, or anything like that. I would have personally thought that their necks, like if slamming with a blunt impact with a neck, just side slamming something, would have probably broken that theropod, literally. Would have broken, sorry my English. Yeah, that would have, I think, made more sense for them to do that, because the mass behind that hit would have been tremendous. Because it's not only coming from the neck, which is also quite thick and muscular and heavy, but it's also coming from the body weight that gets put into it when they turn as well, because it's coming from your legs, from your limbs as well, altogether. Kind of helps when I, being an ex-martial artist who understands the physics behind these things a little bit. So, yeah, I am happy with it as well. So, shall we move on to the next dinosaur?
Sure. Let's move on to the next dinosaur.
All right. Let's see what else shall we get. Let's go for. I want to go for Stegosaurus.
All right.
Now, let's quickly adjust the image, because obviously there is a bit of a misalignment there. Just want to make sure that it's fixed properly. Because there's important parts of it that I wanted you to also address in this. And so who shall start? Shall I start or shall you start? What do you think? What do you want to do?
If you want to start, you can.
Okay. So I'll start with a very basic thing. So first of all, yes, Stegosaurus, and I believe based on the appearance, as you correctly labeled it, it's Stegosaurus stenops, based on the shape of the plates, and also because it was estimated to have been a smaller size species compared to the ungulatus species. So I don't know in terms of time period how they coexisted or not, whether they preceded one another and how, in what order, if at all, but for that purpose, we can leave this out for now. I don't think it's the most important thing. I think the important thing is that we can identify this safely to be a Stegosaurus stenops. And note on its appearance, generally happy overall, but of course, if I were to go back to them and tell them, guys, or if they were to make this today and said, well, this is the model that we've produced, right? I would have maybe encouraged them to add osteoderms on the sides of the body, because that's actually, there's evidence for it for them, so it's probably something that they should have done. Now, the other thing as well, that it was a bit vague. I don't necessarily treat it as a major negative point, but it's more so just how the program and narration script itself was a bit vague about it. That they said that the snout is toothless, and that is hard to understand what they were referring to, because the frontalmost part was a beak, basically, which we know it was, which is one of the reasons why I always had a major issue with the design of Jurassic franchises Stegosaurus, because they didn't show the beak properly. It was just showing, well, lips, which is another major big no-no, as we know already. And but this one here, kind of, it's correct, but it's also not precise enough to elaborate what do they mean by that. So, because we know that they do have teeth further back, but they don't have teeth, obviously, because they have a beak at the very frontmost part of it. So that was a bit vague and a bit confusing for me. That does not, however, mean that overall it negatively represents anything else, because if you look at the animal design, you can see where the beak is, you can see what the snout looks like, and it looks to me like it's well done, generally speaking, like overall decently done job on the Stegosaurus reconstruction, or at least a very decent attempt of it, I would say.
I would agree on that. I think if there was one other thing that I and it just occurred to me now that would be a little bit iffy on was, so I know that a few years back when Sophie was discovered, the implication was that Stegosaurus, and I forget if Sophie was stenops or
Stenops.
ungulatus.
No,
Okay, she was
stenops.
stenops.
Stenops, yep.
Okay, so Sophie was stenops. I think the implication with Sophie was that Stegosaurus stenops at least may have had a slightly longer neck, not anywhere close to like Miragaia or any of those kinds of Stegosaurs, but maybe a little bit longer. So I don't know how if maybe like if someone were to look at the model and adjust it, if they would make the neck a little bit longer than and I do have a skeletal reconstruction of the Stegosaurus stenops from the Field Museum in Chicago, as well as a depiction of it with Nobu Tamura, where they do have necks that are more alike with that of the documentary's depiction. Partially because I don't really find too many like Stegosaur depictions that sort of follow the Sophie neck idea, unless I'm missing something with that. So, but aside from that, I agree that Stegosaurus, in general, the model is I really like it, and I think it holds up pretty well, all things considered.
I wanted to also mention, of course, one other thing about Stegosaurus. They is the eternal question, a never-ending question of how would they do it, quote unquote, right?
Right.
So it's very interesting to note, and that we don't truly understand this even today, as far as I know. Like, there have been multiple ideas proposed, but I think you have a funny story to share about that part. So why don't you go ahead
Yeah,
and tell us? I don't want to steal it from you.
sure. So, some years ago, I forget when this was. I was making my way on the internet, and I stumbled upon some video. I must have been on the internet for too long because I stumbled upon a video where, funnily enough, I don't think I told you this. It might have had Alex Jones on it. But anyways, there was some debate about whether or
Of
not
course, it had
dinosaurs
to
are
have
real.
him on it.
Yes, of course. And it was whether or not dinosaurs are real, right?
Oh God.
And the comment sections, the comments were so cringe. And one of them, this is why I brought the story up specifically for this. One of the comments said, you know, if dinosaurs were real, how could Stegosaurus mate? Or I know that dinosaurs couldn't have been real because how could Stegosaurus have mated? And he thinks this is like such a strong argument when it's like, really, buddy? Like, so
How come hedgehogs and porcupines are real then?
yes. Then how do you explain how porcupines and hedgehogs do it? And I know someone's gonna be like, well, they're not the same. But it's like you're gonna have the same problem where it's like a male Stegosaurus is gonna have to avoid accidentally hurting himself on the female's tail while they're doing it. So, I just think, and considering that Stegosaurus only has the spikes on the tail, I think it's not out of the realm of believability that they could pull it off. I just don't know how, and I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty details about that, but it's you gotta get better arguments, man. Just because Stegosaurus has a big old tail that might have made copulation like kind of awkward does not mean it's fake. Just yeah, it was just one of those days on the internet.
Here's the funny thing about it as well. As much as I like to obviously joke about how I am a pro, quote unquote, in this topic in general, like there's nothing I probably don't know about it, or so I like to joke about anyway. People, this is a joke, yeah, just so don't like take it too seriously in case somebody's trying to clip it. But you can clip it and spread it around. I don't give a fuck. But anyway, what I was gonna say is, it's not quite probably for Stegosaurus as simple as, you take the D and you put it into the V, then you make a move and then you finish and everything is done and then you have the baby, right? So there must have been obviously some sophisticated way they would have come up with how to do it. But in case of porcupine, you mentioned example, like, there is a legit reason to believe that because Stegosaurus was around as an animal, there were many of them there, then they must have found a way to do it. There would not be that
Right.
many of them if there was no way to do it. And I am pretty sure a male porcupine in this case, if you're going to that parallel example, yeah, while the female only gets quote unquote stabbed by one item from behind, which was, fair enough, I guess. But the male has a danger of being legit stabbed by much sharper objects that could potentially even kill him if he is not careful. So,
Right.
there's that
Right.
point to make too. And yet they still do it, and they are just fine. So, yeah. I don't understand, obviously. Obviously, I would have loved to see the face of the individual who posted that stupid comment, unless it was maybe just a troll comment, I guess. But who knows?
Sometimes when you go in those corners, you never know.
You
You
just
want to
never
think
know,
they're
yeah.
trolls, but you never know. And
These
just
day-
so anyone,
Yeah, these days
What?
especially, it's just impossible to tell, because a lot of times you would think that this person is trolling or joking, and then you realize that a lot of situations these people are legit serious when they say something stupid like that. It's not even funny anymore. I actually think, my God, you need help. I'm sorry, but you need help.
right, right. What was I gonna say? Oh, and just in case for anyone who's watching this who's either not seen the documentary or it's been like a while, the reason we're even bringing this up is because it's a major plot point in the Stegosaurus subplot of this segment, where a male is trying to impress a female, and well, he wins her over in the end. But it's a bit of a plot point, pretty big one in the segment. So that's why we're even going into this in the first place.
Yeah, I would not be
Just for anyone unaware.
subjecting. Yeah, I don't think we would be subjecting our listeners to this if it wasn't actually a point, because the documentary does actually emphasize quite a bit on it, and I think the pose they chose as well is just basically male literally goes and mounts her from the top, right? He literally just mounts her on top, kind of. I think.
Sort of. I think it's like he
It's like a
angles
top.
himself.
Yeah, angles. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's safe from the tail, which is
And-
the biggest thing.
Well, and he's also safe from the plates as well. Like, he doesn't just go directly
Right.
on the back. He kind of tilts, like angles himself slightly sideways to avoid the plates somehow, and manages to do it. So
Gotcha.
well done him, my guy. Well done.
Yeah, for sure.
It's like I cannot not support my fellow man out there trying to succeed in his endeavors, because here's another thing where he succeeded. Although I found that to be a generally not a very smart, well-written scene for a variety of reasons, but I guess they kind of wanted to show it off a bit more, of how he actually also manages to contribute, to winning the female over, is that they, while he's flirting with her, they get disturbed by Ceratosaurus, a nosy Ceratosaurus, pun unintended, that it's basically attacks them. Although that is where my problem comes in specifically, because while we do see that, here's how I think it should have been done. What they had, basically, the scene was showing them being interrupted. Ceratosaurus charges at the Stegosaurus couple. The male basically whacks it with the tail. Stegosaurus somehow actually does not impale it with the tail. The Ceratosaurus gets up like nothing happened, then just runs off. Be like, fine, okay, whatever, I get your argument, I'm out of here. But what I would have wanted to see instead, and that might sound a bit more boring to many people probably listening to this, is I would have liked them to just show how there would have been a standoff and sort of tension building up to see, is the Cerato gonna charge? Is he gonna just stand back? What's gonna happen, And you would be expecting that it's gonna charge, but in the end it would just choose to simply stand down and basically keep going its own way and leave them be. Which I think 99% of the times what would have happened. Even if it was a lone Stegosaurus, if it was an adult, I don't believe that a Ceratosaurus would have specifically wanted to charge something like that, especially when the other party, Stegosaurus, is already aware of its presence and it's already showing off threats, showing that if you get close, I'm gonna whack you. So don't do it. It's like, I have the high ground, don't try it, basically.
Ceratosaurus is like, you underestimate my power.
Yeah, literally, and got, well, owned. But except
Yeah,
that he got lucky and got up like nothing happened and walked off.
for sure.
So, and this is where I wanted you to also elaborate. What is the image on the very right hand side showing?
So, sure. So the image on the far right is a reconstruction of an Allosaurus vertebrae being skewered by a Stegosaurus tail spike, Thagomizer. Now, the reason why I put this up is because, and I'm not as against the scene now as I used to be, like when we like a day ago, but that Ceratosaurus, boy, was he lucky. If that Stegosaurus's tail did not happen to land like on the blunt side of the spikes, number one, that Ceratosaurus's ankles would have been broken and skewered, and number two, those spikes would have probably have been driven, based on what I remember from the documentary, into either the spine or part of the leg, like I think the humerus area of the leg, and yeah, if those spikes actually punctured in, that Ceratosaurus would not be getting up. It would be in serious trouble. And Allosaurus, I know for a fact, we have plenty of specimens of Allosaurus sustaining very grievous injuries and yet still leaving able to live after those injuries. But I'm not sure if we have too many of that from Ceratosaurus. And that's not to say that Ceratosaurus couldn't have lived after those injuries, but man, that would have been really hard and really brutal. So my initial concern was that the Stegosaurus tail spikes, it just felt like in the documentary itself that it trips up the Ceratosaurus as it's going in for an attack, and then it just whacks it down without necessarily doing any like physical open wounds from this defense. And again, I'm willing to believe that it just so happened to hit like the blunt side of these spikes, but you know, in any other circumstance, I would imagine that Ceratosaurus would have been in so many new levels of crap after that incident, where it's got a shattered and possibly punctured ankle, and it's also got like massive trauma to its leg and its back. So, and I just wanted to show that because it was one of the few things that I was initially kind of like not liking about the segment with Stegosaurus, where you know you have this animal, and I also in the bottom left corner I showed where the spikes are in much greater view. Like, you know, they by all accounts they should have like done some worse damage, but obviously in this case the Ceratosaurus got immensely lucky, and for that it still would have hurt. Don't get me wrong, like being hit by the blunt side of those spikes would have still hurt. I just think, like, you know, that Ceratosaurus better count as blessings, because it could have been so much worse, and we have evidence that it could have been so much worse. So,
And this is another interesting thing, that you know how frequently a lot of the pop culture or media, whatever, anywhere where these animals are represented, they frequently, for some reason, pit together Stegosaurus and Ceratosaurus. But it's funny, I don't believe we actually have evidence of Ceratosaurus specifically preying on Stegosaurus or any injuries of Ceratosaurus sustaining them from Stegosaurus defense spikes, like in this case.
certainly, yeah, certainly not compared to Allosaurus.
No. Not to mention that Ceratosaurus, we don't have nearly as many specimens, of course, as it was not nearly as common of, not yet at least, we don't know how many truly, but it's not, we don't have nearly as many at least specimens found of them as we do Allosaurus, which probably might even explain why we have so much more information about Allosaurus than the other ones, because we just simply have more of them, which is perfectly makes sense, no brainer here. But it's still very fascinating to see that we do have evidence to show that maybe Allosaurus did indeed actually have some kind of interest in hunting Stegosaurus. Maybe they would try to hunt for something that was smaller, like it does, and who knows, maybe the adult, a larger animal came to the defense, or maybe it underestimated the power again, of the other animal, even though if it was a smaller one, and it just got, well, brutally taught a lesson. F around and find out, basically.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that definitely made I think they chose to do this is because they wanted to show that this male is showing off to female that, look, I am so strong, I can protect you, like, from dangerous predators, and our offspring potentially is gonna be safe from them as well, right? So therefore, let's get some fucky. I like how I just censored the F word before I said that, and then all of a sudden I just use it full on. Yeah. Great, well done, AK. Anyway, it's not like I'm monetized or anything, so I don't give a fuck. But there may be some younger audience perhaps listening to this, but hey, listen to your own peril. I'm an adult. We have a lot of adults here, so we talk like adults here too. But in any case, I wanted to say that this is clear that this is why the documentary chose to do this, but I am not sure if I was obviously in favor of this choice. I think that they could have easily done without it and still found other ways perhaps to get that Stegosaurus to get under her panties, if you will.
Yeah.
So, anything else you wanted to add about this Stegosaurus? Maybe the fact that they've actually correctly, illustrated it having a tail parallel to the ground as well, not like a dragging one or hanging too low to the ground, like even Jurassic World for some reason chose to do even though they already had a nice baseline from the second movie.
It's weird how, like, side tangent, but it's weird how, like, the Lost World Jurassic Park has a more up-to-date Stegosaurus in Jurassic World. But yeah, I really appreciate the fact that and I'll also give this praise to Walking with Dinosaurs as well, but I do appreciate the fact that the Stegosaurus in When Dinosaurs Roamed America has, like, a much more horizontal tail. It's not just hanging just above the ground. Even the Field Museum reconstruction here sort of has it built that way. So it's really nice to know that the Stegosaurus, like I've said, I think it holds up really well in terms of modeling. There's, like, a couple things about it that are iffy, but in general, I think it, like, if someone were to give this to me, I'd probably give it, like, at least a 95 out of 100, probably. So it's really good. In general, I like most of. In general, I think most of the dinosaurs in this segment are really good in terms of modeling and depiction for the most part.
There are a few problems which we will get to shortly, which are mainly to do with
we will get to them.
Yeah,
we will get to them, but so far they've been really good.
So far, they've been very good indeed. But
yes,
with Stegosaurus as well, the only reason why I also would take away 5 points out of 100 is because they don't have osteoderms on the sides. That's really that's really the only thing for me. That's really the only thing.
Yeah.
Now, anything else about the Stegosaurus?
I think I'm good.
I think I'm good as well. Now let's go into our predators. Let's start from where is it? Where are you cheeky git? Let's go for the Ceratosaurus.
Okay.
Let me just make sure that the image is correctly adjusted. Yep. Okay. Now, I have quite a few things to say about it. Of course, yes, time period is correct. Ceratosaurus did indeed exist for quite a long duration, actually, during the Morrison formation time span. If what I know from it is correct, it outlived Allosaurus jamansoni and witnessed, the appearance of Allosaurus fragilis. It outlived Diplodocus and witnessed other sauropods taking its place. It outlived Camarasaurus grandis and also, so it basically outlived quite a lot of different animals throughout the points of time that it was discovered, at least during certain time periods, if I am to believe the information that I found.
Yeah, it's interesting how the documentary calls it like for being the last of its kind. At least it's said in the documentary. It was really successful, and that's not to say that like Ceratosaurus might have been the last of its personal branch within Ceratosauria, but obviously, like we
Which
know
is not
that.
true, by the way.
Oh, that is not true. Right. Wasn't there like, yeah, you're gonna.
Yep.
Isn't it like
Uh,
Genedectes
yep,
or?
yep, early Cretaceous of
Okay.
South America. And
Yep.
also,
Yep.
well, technically, if we talk about Ceratosaurus proper, yes, but if we talk about Ceratosauria in general as a big family, then obviously far from the truth all the way to the extinction, because Abelisaurid happened.
Right. So, it wasn't the last Ceratosaurid, but even if we were to just say that it were, it was still very successful, like a
Extremely
very
successful,
successful
yes.
theropod. Not at all like some weak pansy, like not necessarily that this documentary shows that, but in other documentaries we'll review down the line, they kind of make Ceratosaurus into a bit of a pansy, but it really wasn't. It was a very successful and I think very efficient predator during the late Jurassic, and it's one of the reasons why I kind of prefer it over Allosaurus sometimes. Uh, but yeah, so that was my bit.
Well, I like the fact that obviously Ceratosaurus is actually one of my uh, favorite theropods, full stop. Like, it's coming close, maybe second or third, depending on how you put them together, after like Tyrannosaurus Rex, basically.
Yeah.
Because the horns and stuff like that, it's like a literal dragon basically for me. So that's like always, and because it has osteoderms as well along the back too, it's just like it's everything about it screams dragon. So aside from obviously wings, but not all dragons had wings either, by the way. So there it is. But
It's a very iconic looking dinosaur.
extremely iconic looking dinosaur. But there is, of course, some criticism I have about it in terms of how they chose to portray it. First of all, of course, if we look at the model itself, notice that they do for some reason decide to put osteoderms on its sides as well, rather than just sticking to the ones along the back, which is where we know the evidence was found, and it's very prominent evidence too. And the other thing that obviously irks me is obviously the visible fenestrae, which even still to this day exists as a dumb trope, which should just freaking die already, but it doesn't. And I guess maybe it has something to do with the quality of the animation, but certain parts about how it was moving, I guess, felt a bit awkward, I suppose. And I'm also kind of willing to argue that maybe the Ceratosaurus, perhaps in the show, was done based on a holotype specimen, which was not a big specimen, really, if you think about it, in comparison to other specimens of Ceratosaurus that were bigger and stockier and actually go almost toe-to-toe with Allosaurus, to which point we're gonna get very, very quickly. Now, one thing that it showed was interesting, that while it didn't really, like, yes, it's true, it made some sounds when it was trying to get that Dryosaurus and have when it was hunting it, but I think it was good that they didn't make it announce its presence by screaming its lungs out, which is one of the things that a lot of times pop culture does. It makes the predators scream their lungs out to make it, oh my god, it's a roar, it's warning, like, oh my god, it's here, like, they're trying to make it like drama. And I'm glad that this one doesn't do it. I was so freaking happy to realize that even as far back as those years when this show was made, they somehow, call it luck perhaps, they didn't do it like that. It's like, yeah, it made some kind of sound, but it wasn't screaming its lungs out to the point where it would be just dead giveaway that, yeah, look, I'm here, I'm about to kill you, so just stand there and wait for me to get close and bite your freaking face off. So so the next thing about Ceratosaurus on my side is well, I did mention, of course, about the fact that it's charged against a Stegosaurus, which was just not something that predators would do. Predators have also a very good self-preservation instinct, which means that if they perceive a certain danger, they are not gonna willingly risk themselves, being hurt badly or killed over something that is not worth it, basically. And the Stegosaurus, generally speaking, is probably not worth it, considering that there's a lot of other animals around that you could try to poke your luck with, potentially. So, yeah,
Right.
I guess those are the points. There are also things about, obviously, but I don't know whether this should transition. I mean, do you want to say something about Ceratosaurus specifically, or shall we
Well,
transition
I
into the
think
next one? Because that's kind of transition into the next one, where the point I was gonna make next.
sure. Well, I think for me, the Ceratosaurus model, I think right now the biggest issue I have with it, aside from what you've brought up, is if I were to go back and change this, I would probably have made the horns like more blade-like. They do come off a bit more like conventional horns that you'd see on, not necessarily like a, I guess maybe the nose horns of a ceratopsian, not nearly as bad as like some depictions I've seen, but they do definitely look a bit less like. So in the middle top section is the skull of Ceratosaurus from the Brigham Young University Museum of Paleontology, and also the skeleton of Ceratosaurus on the right there is from the Utah Museum of Natural History. Both of these photos were taken by me, by the way. Um, and so uh, these horns, well, horns, they're more blade-like in appearance, and so they and meanwhile in the documentary they seem a bit like fatter. I really wish there was a better word I can use, but they're a bit more robust than
They're
what's
thicker.
displayed on there. They're thicker, yeah,
They're
they're
wider
thicker.
and thicker, rather than being a bit more
Yes,
shallow and narrow.
right, right. And I think so. I think it's more of a thing for me now because considering that Ceratosaurus horns were nothing like they were not thick. They were very blade-like, and so it's just one of those things that I personally had issues with regarding the depiction itself. But otherwise, I pretty much agree with all the other ones, all the other points you brought up with Ceratosaurus's depiction and also its appearance. I still am pretty happy that they used it in
Yeah,
the way that they did in this documentary because, it could have very easily been. Because I will say this, Walking with Dinosaurs did not use Ceratosaurus
and that
in
was my
either
biggest disappointment, by the way, that they did not pick that animal at all to appear, at least briefly.
Right, right. It's one of those things where I just think it would have added an extra layer to the setting itself, but that they just didn't for one reason or another. And I'm just really glad that Discovery took up Ceratosaurus, even if, as we're going to see, it kind of gets shafted in favor of Allosaurus, rather unfairly. But I'm still glad they used it. So.
Yeah, and one thing about the so-called horn to bring up as well, maybe worth mentioning, is that you would obviously be able to confirm it since you've been able to get up close to the specimens. The only specimen, and it was a cast by the way as well, not the original, that I've seen of a Ceratosaurus, to my knowledge at least, was in Glasgow Kelvin Grove Museum a couple years back. It was a cast of a juvenile specimen, actually, which was a very interesting piece as well. And the other one, if I remember correctly, was there one or not? I can't remember. There was at least a skull of the holotype, right? In the American Museum of Natural History, I believe. Or it
There
was a
might have been, but I have
or a
not been to
cast
the
maybe.
American Museum. Maybe a cast, but I haven't been to the American Museum yet.
I can't remember. I get the feeling that I've seen the holotype skull at least, or its copy.
Yeah,
Like I have the feeling
yeah,
that I've seen it, but I can't quite trace where have I seen it. But those are the only. If I know about the juvenile 100%. But the point I'm leading up to is the horn itself is not really a horn. It's actually a crest.
right. It's more of a yeah crust.
And the other thing important to point out is that the model also fails. Like it looks like they're making it like it's got three horns basically, but in actual fact, the ones that are the lacrimal crests are literally the same ones that Allosaurus has, but only just maybe they have their own kind of similar kind of shape. In fact, if you really think about it carefully, if you look at it.
Yeah.
So they're just basically lacrimal, like protrusions, crests, or if you will, extensions.
Right.
But they're not actually supposed to be like those type of looking like those type of horns. Perhaps, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think it's quite a correct way to portray that sort of restoration in flesh, if in my personal opinion.
Right.
So
and either way, I think that they would not have been as prominent as the one on the snout. Like
not at all.
In the picture you see with the eating the Dryosaurus, you will see that there's the nose one is definitely bigger, but it's like the other two are more comparable. Whereas in reality, I think the nose one would have been much more prominent, which you can kind of see in the reconstruction by Sergei. Wait, no, this is not. This is not Sergei. This is Dmitry Bogdanov, Ceratosaurus in the bottom right there. They would not have been equal in size.
No.
So.
And the other thing to understand is that when you restore the crest with the fleshed out and everything, you add a certain amount of keratin layer that will obviously bulk it up a bit too. So
right,
it wouldn't
now
just.
I was gonna say, be careful with that statement.
Yeah, because
people
that's gonna
like to exaggerate that.
Yep. They're gonna make basically a bunch of Ceratosaurus pieces now with looking like freaking unicorns or something, or like an elasmotherium or whatever. But no, that's not what I mean. I absolutely mean that it would add a bit of volume, thus making and confirming, reasserting, the point of them being bigger than the lacrimal crest. Basically, that's what I'm trying to say. But yeah, anyway, let's transition, if you don't mind, to the last dinosaur, because we do have one more animal to quickly mention, but that will be a very last one. But before that, we want to go to Allosaurus, because there are quite a few things I have to say about that one for sure. And that's where I transition to the point where that you have also mentioned about how Ceratosaurus basically in the end ended up getting shafted in favor of Allosaurus, and not quite fairly. Now, I have quite a few things to say about it, but first, before we do, well, this is very interesting because the size depiction that they've chosen for this Allosaurus, for one, personally, I'm not a big fan of the model generally. I don't know why, it just looks very shrink-wrapped. It's got these ribs and everything like that. It's just, I don't know, I'm just not a fan of it, honestly. That's probably I think in this episode, Allosaurus is the weakest looking one for me personally.
Yes, and not to mention that the face itself is super gnarly, which I'm kind of, I don't know, it's hard to describe, and I'm not saying it just looks really bumpy and, again, like gnarly, and I compare it to this one depiction by, let me quickly double check who this Allosaurus was by. It was, I don't know if I know the name, but it's by a guy named Finwall, I believe, and the Allosaurus there looks, at least with the skull, it does not look nearly as bumpy as what we see in the documentary, which I don't completely understand, but yeah, it's the weakest looking dinosaur. I think it's the weakest looking dinosaur in the whole program, in my opinion.
I think you could make that case. I would also say that it's, if you compare it, for example, to some of the earlier dinosaurs we have reviewed already, like Dilophosaurus specifically, it definitely doesn't quite hold up to it either. Even though Dilophosaurus has its flaws in that, in certain cases that we have already reviewed, so you should check out the previous episode if you want to know more about that. But I do think that Allosaurus, even compared to the later designs, it's probably, I would argue, is indeed the weakest looking one, in my personal view. Like, there's just too many things that I find to be wrong about it. Legs, for example, look at the legs in the left, where it's basically, as we can see, shafting that Ceratosaurus. Like the legs look like they're just way too long, and Allosaurus didn't
Yeah,
have legs that long at all. That's not the case.
right.
And there's something weird going on with its neck on the lower left shot as well, lower left corner. I mean, especially compared to the image right next to it in the middle on the bottom. That you already mentioned it, I believe. But yeah, this this artwork, at least from the glimpse, I mean, I cannot tell if the model has lips or not, which it probably
It does not.
It does not.
It does not. It's hard to see the teeth. I will admit the teeth are very hard to see, especially with how small the image is. But it does not have, at worst it has half lips. But you do see teeth there. So.
Okay, well, I mean, we also know that Allosaurus actually did have pretty small teeth in comparison to many other theropods anyway.
Sure.
So, yeah, I have to say, this is a pretty good looking Allosaurus. This is the kind of Allosaurus I would have wished I saw.
Right, exactly.
And now here's where the problems come as well. The size of it. The size of it actually is based on what I'm looking at in terms of the way the model is shown. Not only do we probably... It's basically like they made Allosaurus bigger and they made Ceratosaurus based on a smaller specimen, which is probably the holotype specimen, completely ignoring that we have at least two other specimens of Ceratosaurus. Well, there are at least three specimens of Ceratosaurus that are bigger than the holotype. 3 or 4 maybe, but 2 of them are definitely considerably bigger than the holotype, and they are both about 7-ish meters long, quite stocky specimens. And in the previous shot that we have reviewed, the mound in the Utah Museum is actually one of the biggest specimens as well. One of them has once been mistakenly labeled Dentissulcatus as the species, but as of 2015, I believe that species was sunk and it was just dismissed as individual variation of Ceratosaurus nasicornis. So, and that's why I'm treating it as Ceratosaurus nasicornis as well. Now, and then we have Allosaurus that got oversized, which corresponds more to a size of another potential Allosauroid in this place, Saurophagonix maximus, or potentially Allosaurus maximus, but I think maybe Saurophagonix would be a fair point. But let's call it Saurophagonix. And if it were a Saurophagonix, I would have probably say, yeah, that Ceratosaurus would have been outclassed quite a bit, because we're talking about an animal that is the size of a Torvosaurus, which does outclass Ceratosaurus. But it also outclasses Allosaurus, because Allosaurus, if we look at the image that we have here of the fragilis, this is actually quite well represented on in terms of what the average size of them would have been. And they go to about 8 to 8.5 meters in length, not like 10 or 11 meters in length, as many times in the books they were always listed for some reason. And the problem is that why it cannot be a Saurophagonix is because Saurophagonix currently, to our knowledge, is dated as 151 million years ago, and this... Oh, sorry, my elbow slipped, so it made a bump noise. Sorry guys who are listening, that might have been recorded by accident. If not, then ignore it. But anyway, I wanted to say that Saurophagonix did not live in the 150 million year period to our knowledge. And because we don't have a lot of specimens, so we don't know how far it, went. What was the range of the time periods that it covered? Now, what I wanted to point out is that if that's the case, then we cannot actually agree with the documentary's portrayal, because Allosaurus was simply not that big. It just simply wasn't. And Ceratosaurus, based on several specimens we know, they get quite a bit bigger to the point where Ceratosaurus goes up to 7 meters, Allosaurus is about 8 to 8.5 meters on average. And Ceratosaurus, we don't know if it was the upper end or if it was the average or not, but we do know that from whatever limited amount of material we have from Ceratosaurus, we do have more specimens that are on the bigger side of things than they are on the smaller side, so it kind of gives me a reason to assume that they could maintain this as an average size, being at 7 meters in length. Even though originally, I believe James Madsen estimated the bigger Ceratosaurus specimen to be like something like 8.8, almost like, not 8.8, yeah, maybe like, I think it was 8.4 or 8.8 meters length, which is pretty huge. But I think they were later revised as just 7 meters, which I think is more likely. In any case, this would not have been that straightforward of a confrontation or just a straight up ambush and totally just destroyed like nothing. This Ceratosaurus was a nasty biter, nastier than an Allosaurus probably, based on the size of the teeth. It was very stocky for its dimensions, and it would have been able to potentially put up a decent fight to the point where that Allosaurus probably would have thought it was not worth it to mess around with it. I mean, a bit like lions a lot of times don't bother messing around with honey badgers, because they're just really nasty. Why would you want to mess with the biggest asshole of animal kingdom? So, well, I mean, I still think geese are the biggest assholes of animal kingdom, but you can debate me on that in the comments if you want. But anyway, I think I've pretty much concluded my entire point, is that I think that this scene was just severely misleading in my opinion about what Allosaurus was and what Ceratosaurus was, what they both were as animals in that sense, and how this would have gone down if they really were, confronting one another. So there it is, as Malcolm says.
Well, I don't have too much to add per se to that. I knew that was going to be something I wanted, that you had a lot to say on, and I wanted you to be the one to say it. Honestly, I'm not going to really defend much about this Allosaurus. I think the only time that I felt like I looked at it and thought, okay, this is, kind of unique and I really like it, was when the 3 Allosaurus show up to the crippled Apatosaurus and just start chowing down on it, which, again, I will say is, going back to my Apatosaurus point, I think it's just, kind of nice to have a documentary that shows that, where, just for all its size and power, if an animal like that is crippled and made, and the difficulty level for killing it is significantly diminished, well, predators are just going to take advantage of it and just tear it apart, and that's what we see in the end. The narration also makes a point of saying that Allosaurus will vanish into extinction with I like how, I don't think this was intentional, but I like how John Goodman basically puts some sort of emphasis on will vanish into extinction. So, which is true. Sorry that Walking with Dinosaurs aged like milk, but Allosaurus after the Jurassic is gone. And, it doesn't just persist in Australia or wherever, other pieces of media think it does. It was a very successful theropod, very well known theropod. I mean, it is my state fossil. It is my state fossil. And it is very much one of the most well-known theropods besides Tyrannosaurus Rex. In fact, I think we even have more specimens of it than Tyrannosaurus Rex. But I also, it's still only lasted until the end of Jurassic. And honestly, when you compare it with Ceratosaurus and Torvosaurus and Saurophaganax, it was also not this ubermensch of the Morrison formation. It was very good at what it did, but it was not the ubermensch. And this is not the only time that the Allosaurus sort of came off that way, and there is certainly more browbeat. There's more programs that browbeat the whole idea that it was an Ubermensch, but this is I still have to criticize this documentary for doing this because yeah, it just wasn't it just was not that. And like I said, I consider it the weakest looking dinosaur in the program. And so for that, I guess for all the praise I have for everything else of this segment, this is where I'm spending most of my criticism. So, but that's really all I have to say about Allosaurus for this segment.
Yeah. No, I'm the same. I'm the same. I already said it, so I would be repeating myself if I said the same thing again. That yes, I indeed agree that it's a weakest designed dinosaur so far in this whole program, and I think not so far. But even if you compare to some of the future designs, which of course we can debate whether or not that's the case, but I do think it's definitely a very strong candidate of being the worst designed dinosaur in the whole program. So. We shall see, because there will be things to mention probably in the future, but that will be another time. In any case, I wanted to also agree, however, with the point that one of the things that I found to be a bit more redeeming was that they showed how they immediately went for that injured Apatosaurus and just started eating it while it was alive. That was truly nice touch, and I think that it was nice that they decided not to hold back from that and not to kind of present it that, oh, they're just gonna wait for it to die slowly or get so weak that the animal cannot do anything. No, they just went right in there. They started biting at it while the freaking thing was like there, completely helpless, could not do anything.
Still alive, and like literally, if you watch the individual Allosaurus, some of them actually do start consuming meat. So that thing was being eaten alive, which is kind of horrifying. But I'm really glad that Discovery had balls and they put that in there. So,
all right. So I'm happy where we are with this. Now let's go to our last creature.
Yes.
And just make a brief mention on it, and then after that we will have some concluding shot that you wanted to talk about, and after that we will call it the.
Yes. So I wanted to give, because in the first segment that we did of this program, I talked about the random appearance of that quoll that we just assumed was like probably meant to be some synapsid or cynodont, but obviously did not look anything like a cynodont. And so in the program, in this segment here, there's a couple shots as the Camarasaurus and Dryosaurus are walking to a grove of trees that there's a random pterosaur that's flying about. Now, I have no idea what pterosaur this is. The model doesn't really give us much of anything to base it off of. And there actually isn't any pterosaurs that I'm aware of that have been found at the monument, and most of the pterosaurs that I'm aware of, the Morrison, come from Colorado and Wyoming. But I don't think there's been too many, if any, that have been found in Utah. But since we have a pterosaur in this program, I figured that this is in terms of appearance. This is not in terms of time period or stratigraphy or anything like that, strictly based on appearance, because that's all we've got to base this off of in the program. I went with Harpactognathus, which you can see a skull there.
Yep.
And there's also a size comparison with Harpactognathus with a human. I am not going to say if it's correct or incorrect, like if it's accurate or inaccurate, because we only see it for a few nanoseconds and it's gone. So I have no clue what it is and if it's even remotely correct, but I wanted to give it its due time, because they made a model, they put it in the program, might as well bring it up.
I agree. I think it is a Harpactognathus. even if, of course, it's slightly out of the time period, because
Yeah.
Harpactognathus is known, I think, from Wyoming, and if I am correct, it's dated to be 156 to about 152.1 million years ago. So technically, if no more of them are found, then in a younger layers, then we can assume that the 152.1 million years ago is when it technically goes extinct, disappears. So we don't know really what they intended. They could have actually just intended it to be a Rhamphorhynchus, because there were a lot of old depictions of Allosaurus coexisting with Rhamphorhynchus, even though there may have been, I don't even know if Rhamphorhynchus actually lived. Maybe, I mean, there may be, because there are multiple species of them, but the Rhamphorhynchus are European animals. They're not North American.
Rhamphorhynchus itself was European, but there might have been close relatives that resembled it in North America. But Rhamphorhynchus itself is a European genus, last I heard.
I think
So
Rhamphorhynchids themselves are actually mostly represented by Eurasian genera. I think Harpactognathus might be the only or one of the few, perhaps, that are known from North America. But of course,
yeah,
we will have our man Jeffrey later, sometimes maybe to either comment on the video, or maybe he will elaborate later. And when we get a chance to talk about it, we'll talk about it.
sounds good.
So, and other people in the comments, feel free to elaborate, but to my knowledge, yes, the Harpactognathus is the only one that you can associate it with as the best you can probably tie to it, and based on the design that they've picked, because it's a long-tailed pterosaur as well. If it was short-tailed, you could have argued that it's a Kipodactylus, but it's obviously long-tailed, and as far as we know, Kipodactylus was not a long-tailed pterosaur. Even though both of them, as far as I'm aware of, are very fragmentary, so they are extremely difficult to describe properly and estimate. But based on some bones, I think the relationships have been more or less established. So, anything else you wanted to add about the pterosaur?
I got nothing.
Fair enough.
It's such a cameo that I don't really have much to say on it.
Okay. In this case, let's move to our next and final image. I'm just going to quickly adjust it for the viewers to make sure that it fits the screen, and there we go. So that's the Dinosaur National Monument and sauropod migration. So what did you want to say about this one?
So I decided to combine both the fossil segments with James Kirkland talking about Dinosaur National Monument and sauropods and sauropod migration, because I think I can probably get both of these in the same slide. So the pictures that you see here, the two in the bottom and then the one on the right, are all taken by me. These are all pictures from last summer when I was at Dinosaur National Monument. The sauropod that you see on the right is a Camarasaurus, and it is the, as far as I can tell, the same exact Camarasaurus that is used in the documentary, which is why I specifically chose this one to show in this slide. Now I believe in the program it said it was the most complete sauropod found at the time. I don't know if that's still true, but regardless, it is still very complete, and I still think it's a very good specimen. At the bottom middle is a segment from the monument. I wanted to try and see if I could find a good shot that sort of, not a direct replication, but sort of replicated the camera descending in the segment where James Kirkland talks about Dinosaur National Monument. And I think it's a pretty decent picture overall. And then the bottom left picture is a shot of the visitor center. This is not the quarry wall. The quarry wall is a bit further up. You have to either take a bus there or you can hike there. But this is the visitor center where you go and you can buy souvenirs and all these things, and then that's sort of the hub for people to go and meet up before they go and actually see the quarry wall. So I wanted to just put that in there just for location's sake. The diagram that you see above the quarry wall and the visitor center photos are of this is a diagram of the entire quarry wall, and all the dinosaurs. And I would probably recommend looking this picture up by yourselves on your own time and like actually analyzing what skeletons we have found there. But it is very rich. It remains one of the best, I think, dinosaur sites in the world, one of the best paleontology sites in the world. I would recommend that anyone that goes there that is able to visit, please do. It's definitely worth visiting before you pass on. And it was a really cool site. But the reason why I bring this up is because the first fossil segment, right after the introduction, right after the Ceratosaurus hunt and the introduction of Camarasaurus, we get to hear James Kirkland's interpretation of what was going on. With why do we have so many dinosaurs here? And the general interpretation that he presented, and it's one that I believe still holds up to this day, is that what this quarry represents was a seasonal environment where dinosaurs would often come during the dry season and look for water in seeps. That during the wet season, these rivers and lakes were all flooded and swollen with water. And then during the dry season, even when the main water bodies were gone, these dinosaurs could still look for water in seeps, sort of like what elephants do. And this is sort of shown in the beginning of the episode, which I really like, where we talk about the seasonality of Jurassic North America. And the shot of the Stegosaurus actually digging through the dirt to get to water like an elephant. And what happened, what he seems to interpret is that one very bad year, the water dried up completely. And the animals, not wanting to leave what they, for years upon years upon years, saw as their only source of water, stayed and then died of dehydration or starvation, possibly. And it's not considered a predator trap. It's not like the Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry, which I even did a research paper on that. And as far as I can tell, I also would argue that is not a predator trap either. But Dinosaur National Monument is most certainly not a predator trap. It is, at the moment, from what James has said in the documentary and what I can tell from my current research, this seems to be the accumulation of dinosaurs based on animals that died from drought. And we have a wide range of animals in this wall. Definitely, pretty much all the dinosaurs that you see in this documentary segment are from this wall. There might have been a couple others that might have been in there as well, but it's and so I think it's still an interpretation that holds up. Last I checked, but obviously you can let me know in the comment section if I'm missing something. And then the second bit is regarding sauropod migration, where and as far as I can tell, this is still a very difficult question to answer as to what exactly sauropods were doing, because we know that we find plenty of these sauropod genre and species in multiple areas of the Morrison. So like Camarasaurus is found in Utah, and I'm pretty sure also Colorado and Wyoming. Diplodocus for sure is from Colorado and maybe Wyoming. And so like you obviously see these sauropods that are clearly found in multiple states, mostly in Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, but elsewhere as well. And the question is, well, what were they doing? Why were they traveling so far? And one of the hypotheses is that they were migrating. Now the question is, why were they migrating? And James informs us in the documentary that there are no major nest sites that we see in places like Acamuevo in South America and in Europe, where we do have nest sites of sauropod dinosaurs. But we do have dinosaur eggs for the Morrison Formation. I'm not sure if they've been confirmed to be sauropods, but I also know that there's no big nest sites like what we see in these other places. And so the implication is that whatever these sauropods were doing in these particular areas of the Morrison, they may not have been here to nest. They might have been here for multiple reasons, but so far we have no evidence to support that they were here to lay eggs and such. And I think so far both segments, this is what I like about When Dinosaurs Roamed America, is that we have these segments where we talk about the fossils and just break away from the storyline of the dinosaurs, and we just talk about the evidence. What is the basis behind what we're being shown on screen? And so far, I think both of these segments are still really good, and I'd hold up really well as far as I can tell. So,
I have a quick question.
yes,
Obviously, I don't know a lot about this place. I've only
sure.
heard the name being mentioned fairly frequently. I know that it's famous, and I
Yes,
admit to not knowing a whole lot about the nitty-gritty details of it. Let's just say that much. Now,
sure.
that's the reason why I want to bring up the following question, which is, are the dinosaurs found in there actually still in the quarry, or have there been any dinosaurs extracted from it, or are there any chances that we might have more, dinosaurs extracted from the quarry?
So there have been some specimens, mostly those that you might find at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History and some other places. I think also some at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, that there were some dinosaurs that were excavated from this quarry and then mounted and put on display there. But as far as I can tell, all the dinosaurs that you see in this diagram here, you will see at the quarry. The vast majority. So this site was first found by, oh my gosh, I'm gonna forget his name. It starts with an E. It is not Elmer Riggs. That is what my mind goes to, but he's the guy who may have found Brachiosaurus. Ernest Douglas, Earl Douglas, that's his name. Earl Douglas found the site while looking for mammal stuff, and he petitioned and fought for this site to be presented as a national monument, or at least a national park, because he wanted enough of these specimens to be preserved so that people could see it. And even though we do have certain skeletons that have been excavated out, I would say, if not all of this, 90% of what you see in this diagram is still at the quarry, that is still in the rock and is still left there for people to look at and observe and admire, because that was Earl Douglas's wish. And so, if you were to come fly out here to Utah, and you were to drive out and see the monument, you would see all these specimens would still be there. And I think the current plan is to sort of keep them there so that people can just see them. And in a sense, prove that one guy wrong and show that dinosaurs are real. And we've
Mm-hmm.
left this for you to see. Um, and but I hope that answers your question.
But then, of course, he will say that somebody just put them there conveniently, of course. But
Oh,
yeah,
I mean that guy might, but
yep. Well, that's what I'm saying. There is no limit. The goalpost shifting is gonna be, endless. It's pointless to argue. Basically, it's just a waste of time. But
actually, I want to make a quick correction here. So it's kind of difficult. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see this in the full video, but in the diagram itself, there is a dotted line in like the lower portion of that surrounds the lower portion of this. That dotted line represents like the rock wall that you see there, and everything else surrounding it, I believe, could still be excavated or has already been excavated or found. But the dotted line, if you notice in the bottom middle part of the diagram, is all that is still there. All those dinosaur fossils are still there, for you to see at the monument. So, quick correction on my end, but still, like, those are not going to be excavated. The ones you see at the monument are not planned to be excavated.
is it
Um,
still possible to somehow describe them without excavation?
Yes. So if you were to go there, let's just say you had no idea as to what these dinosaurs were. There's a very neat little pamphlet that you can use, and you can read it and identify where these bones are in the monument. So you could point out exactly where, like, a Camarasaurus humerus is, or a Stegosaurus plate is. You will be able to identify every single one of these dinosaurs from this monument. You might not be able to do it unless you're really good. Um, off the top of your head, but there is a pamphlet that identifies every single one of these bones that has so far been found there.
And one other thing, of course, I was thinking, of course, that's me trying to find sneaky ways around the whole thing, is there any way to potentially identify whether there might be dinosaurs? Do we have any technology to actually identify, like scan or something of sort, the ground to identify if there is any substance or any kind of, something that corresponds, to what a fossilized dinosaur bone might be, in order to find out if there's anything underneath those ones that we have here, so that, let's say, if we wanted to get specimens that are not revealed by this surface in order to preserve the monument, but we want to get them from under, is there no way we can like create some kind of tunnel shaft under the monument, perhaps, to dig from under them, but without touching these specimens, if you will, to preserve the monument? Is that something that's potentially possible to look at, or do you think that will be a big hands-off no-no?
Well, I'm not gonna say never say never, but I also think that would be a mammoth task to accomplish, and that's if it's feasible. Which my concern would be, the last thing I would want is to dig too far, like, and then cause structural integrity problems with the monument, and then it becomes like a risk, like a safety hazard, and then the place gets closed down for that. So I'm gonna say for right now no. I would also say no because it would be a hyper expensive endeavor to go into.
And to be able to dig something like that with that kind of precision, yeah.
Right. That would take a lot of money to pull off, and that's if it was feasible, which I lean towards no, out of risk of structural integrity problems. But at the same time, I know that there's other dinosaurs that can be found in the surrounding area that I think would also be worth. I mean, we're bound to probably find more as time goes on within this little area of northeast Utah, and I think it's there's something really special about this place, and I look forward to hearing more news come about it, and more specimens, and possibly even new dinosaurs to come out of this.
Yeah, we never know. It
yeah,
might be.
I don't know. Maybe I'm biased because I live like 30 minutes away from the monument, but it's definitely something very special, and I'm really glad that, in general, when Dinosaurs Roamed America did a lot of justice to this site, and brought these creatures to life, in general, in a very good way. So.
Definitely. I'm definitely with you on this. It's a very good reference point, where you can always go back to see how it's been at the time, what was thought of at the time, and how it further progressed as more and more studies have been performed in the area to better understand what animals are actually represented there, etc. And
right.
Many other things involved when it comes to dating the site as well. So I think this is definitely a very interesting point, and I'm glad that they preserved it, so at least that way you can actually see what these dinosaurs would have looked like when you find them in this kind of condition. So
right.
It's definitely worth checking out. I know I will check it out when my time comes to go to Utah, which is going to happen eventually. I'm definitely eyeing it up for a while now, so who knows?
Yes.
Maybe we'll do a video there too, or two or more, or something, So
yeah,
we shall see.
For sure.
But anyway, do you have anything else to add to this, or shall we wrap it up?
I think I'm good with wrapping it up. I think we covered pretty much all that I was looking to cover with these two fossil segments.
Okay, cool. And what do you know, by the way, I just accidentally looked at my mobile phone flashing on a screen, and there's a notification of a text message I got from my sister saying that apparently dinner is ready. How perfect of a timing.
Cool.
So, there it is.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, people, thanks for being patient with me and John and this channel, for not being too frequent in terms of posting videos. We are very busy in our real day jobs and commitments, unfortunately, or not, but it's just reality. YouTube is not my job, so as I like to always repeat and remind people in case they forget. And but whenever I do get around to it, I try to bring something here to give you something interesting to listen to and to talk about, hopefully. Now, I want to thank you all for watching. I hope if you are new, you will check out other content and subscribe to this channel. And stay tuned and look forward to future episodes. I think at this point it's safe to reveal one other thing that me and John are definitely planning, and we'll have an extra person on board to do that with us as well, is that after we finish reviewing When Dinosaurs Roamed America, which is 2 episodes away from being finished now, we are going to jump on to reviewing the recent Prehistoric Planet. Oh yeah. And yeah.
Emperor, give me strength.
Yeah. I have yet to actually properly watch all the episodes, which I will do in due time, and also we will have Jason, who is also part of my team at this point, and who has also appeared multiple times on this channel. So he will be joining us for that. So it will be 3 of us doing the review, I would believe, unless someone else decides to jump in as the 4th, or maybe they will jump in and out depending on which episode we're gonna be doing. We'll see. We might actually just make a bit of a hodgepodge of people joining and going in and out. Who knows, maybe to make it a bit more interesting, because I do think that this particular piece will deserve a special attention, and it does need to. It does appear that it's lacking like any reasonable content and takes from people of this community, because everyone seems to be masturbating on it, and I kind of want to provide a slightly different take on it, to be fair, which is part of the reason why many people are actually subscribed to me in the first place, because I don't tend to toe the lines, of the mainstream opinions on these kind of pieces, whichever they are. So, in any case, I want to thank you very much for watching. I want to thank you, John, for joining and helping me out and putting together the presentation slides. And
Sounds good. Thank you for having me.
And until next episode, I guess. Take care.
Cool. Take care.
Bye bye.
Ciao.